As Jesus walked along the streets of Jerusalem with his disciples, the dust of the city clinging to their sandals, they came upon a man who had been blind from birth. His place was familiar to those who passed by, the corner where he sat, the quiet posture of someone who could only listen to the world he could not see. Day after day, he heard the footsteps of strangers, the hushed tones of pity, the occasional clink of a coin dropped into his hand. From the time he was a child, darkness had been his only companion. He had never seen the shape of the city walls, the faces of his parents, or the colors of the marketplace. The disciples, seeing him, asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" In their minds, the blindness was a punishment, a mark of some hidden guilt. But Jesus' reply cut through their assumptions. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Then he added, "As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." The man could not see the face of the one speaking, but there was something in his voice, steady, kind, certain, that made him listen closely. Then he heard the sound of someone stooping down, the scrape of fingers in the dirt, the faint, unexpected sound of spitting. Before he could process what was happening, he felt a cool, gritty paste being applied gently over his closed eyelids. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. The voice came again. "Go, wash in the Pool of Siloam." There was no explanation, no promise of what would happen, just an instruction. Yet something in that command stirred him. Guided by the memory of the streets and the helping hand of a passerby, he made his way to the pool. The journey itself was strange, a mixture of curiosity and hope, the damp clay cooling on his skin, the voice still echoing in his mind. When he finally knelt at the water's edge, he scooped the cool water into his hands and began to wash. The clay loosened, slipping away under the touch of the water. And then suddenly, light broke into his darkness. Shapes and colors rushed in all at once, sky and stone, water and faces. The world that had always been sound and texture was now bursting with vision. He stood there, blinking hard, overwhelmed by the flood of images. The path back to the city felt entirely new, every detail a revelation. The sunlit walls, the patterns in the stone pavement, the expressions of people's faces. By the time he returned, those who had known him as the blind beggar were staring in disbelief. "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" some asked. Others argued, "No, he only looks like him." But he insisted, "I am the man." They asked how it had happened, and he told them plainly, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." The questions came quickly. Where was this Jesus now? Who was he? Why had he done this? But the man could only answer what he knew. He had been blind, and now he could see. It was a fact no one could take from him. His journey from the pool back into the city was more than the walk of a man who had regained his sight. It was the first step into a life where he would have to speak for himself about what had been done for him. This was only the beginning of his testimony. He did not yet have all the answers. He could not explain the how or the why in theological terms, but he could tell his story. He could say what had happened to him and that it had happened because of Jesus. The healing was more than a miracle for his eyes. It was a call to witness. The light that entered his world physically was beginning to take root in his heart, preparing him for the questions, challenges, and disbelief that lay ahead. And as he stood there in the streets of Jerusalem, blinking at the brightness of a world he had never seen, the man knew this much. He would not be silent about what had happened. No matter who questioned him, he could tell them this. Once he was blind, but now he could see. The news of his healing traveled quickly through the narrow streets. Neighbors and acquaintances, curious and unsettled, led him to the Pharisees. It was not unusual for them to be consulted in matters of religious and legal significance, but the man sensed that their interest was more about the circumstances than the celebration. He soon learned that the day Jesus healed him was the Sabbath, a fact that would stir debate more than the miracle itself. The Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. The man answered simply, without embellishment, "He put mud on my eyes and I washed, and now I see." There was no attempt to interpret what had happened, only the plain truth. Yet his words immediately divided the listeners. Some said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." Others countered, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" The room filled with murmurs, their disagreement evident, but the man stood silent, letting them argue among themselves. Finally, they turned back to him. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man thought about it. He didn't have formal training, didn't know the intricate laws as they did, but he knew the power of what he had experienced. "He is a prophet," he said. It was the only conclusion that made sense to him at that moment. Unwilling to accept this, the Pharisees summoned his parents. They asked them if this was truly their son and if he had been born blind. His parents confirmed the obvious. Yes, this was their son, and yes, he had been blind from birth. But when pressed on how he could now see, their voices grew guarded. Fear crept into their answers, for the leaders had already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. "He is of age," they said. "Ask him. He will speak for himself." And so the man was brought before them again. This time, the tone was sharper. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." The man did not flinch. "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." His words were unpolished, yet they carried a weight that no argument could dismiss. They pressed him further. "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" By now the man understood that they were not looking for the truth. They were looking for something to confirm their verdict. "I have told you already," he replied, "and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" His question was not mockery, but a bold challenge. The room bristled at his words. They hurled insults, declaring their allegiance to Moses and rejecting Jesus' authority. Still, the man stood firm. "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." His testimony was clear and unwavering, even in the face of hostility. He had no theological credentials, no status in the religious hierarchy, but he had the truth of his own encounter, and that truth was unshakable. He had been blind. Jesus had given him sight. No amount of interrogation could erase that reality. The Pharisees, unwilling to be persuaded, replied with scorn. "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And with that, they threw him out. The rejection was swift, and the weight of it was heavy. Being cast out of the synagogue meant being cut off from the center of community life. Yet even as he stepped into the streets alone, his heart was not empty. He had spoken the truth, and he would not go back into silence. That day, he lost his place among those who feared to name Jesus. But he gained something greater, the courage to declare what he knew, even when it cost him. His healing had opened more than his eyes. It had opened his voice, and his journey of testimony was far from over. The streets felt quieter after the sharp voices of the Pharisees faded behind him. The man walked without a set destination, his newly opened eyes taking in every detail, the shifting colors of garments, the lines on the faces of passers-by, the bright sunlight pouring over stone walls. Yet beneath the wonder there was a shadow. He had been healed, but now he was marked as an outsider. Those who feared the religious leaders might avoid him, unwilling to risk association with someone publicly dismissed. He had spoken the truth, and the truth had cost him. But the truth had also given him a freedom he had never known. He no longer sat at the roadside begging, dependent on the pity of strangers. He had been touched by a power greater than any earthly authority, and even if the leaders of the synagogue had turned him away, he could not deny what Jesus had done. As he walked, a familiar voice broke through the noise of the street. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man turned toward the sound, his eyes now able to see the one speaking. It was Jesus. He didn't know yet how he had found him, but in that moment, it didn't matter. "Who is he, sir?" the man asked, "that I may believe in him?" It was an honest question. He had defended Jesus before the Pharisees without fully understanding who he was, but his heart was open, ready for the answer. Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. For a man who had lived his entire life in darkness until that very day, the words carried a double weight. The one who had given him sight was the promised Son of Man, the one sent from God. His physical healing had been the doorway to a greater revelation, that the light now in his eyes was matched by the light breaking into his soul. "Lord, I believe," he said, and he fell to his knees in worship. The gratitude he had felt since washing in the Pool of Siloam now deepened into devotion. It was no longer just about what had been done for him, but about who had done it. The man who had been blind saw more clearly than many with perfect vision. Around them, others listened as Jesus spoke. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." His words were aimed at more than physical sight. They exposed the truth that spiritual blindness can live inside those who think they see most clearly. Some Pharisees nearby, hearing this, asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus replied, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." It was a sobering moment, one that contrasted sharply with the joy of the man's worship. From that day forward, the man's story became more than a personal healing. It became a testimony he carried wherever he went. When people asked what had happened, he told them of the day Jesus made mud, spread it on his eyes, told him to wash, and opened his sight. But he also told them of the moment he came to believe, the moment when seeing with his eyes turned into seeing with his heart. He knew now that his journey was not just about moving from blindness to sight. It was about moving from not knowing to knowing, from silence to proclamation, from darkness into the light of Christ. And though he had been cast out of the synagogue, he had been welcomed into something far greater, the kingdom of God. His testimony would continue, not because he had been healed once, but because his life had been forever changed. He had seen the light of the world, and he could not help but point others toward it. In the days that followed, his name was whispered in the markets and along the narrow lanes. Some people spoke of him with awe, marveling at the miracle. Others carried the skepticism of the religious leaders, suggesting perhaps it had been some trick or that the blindness had not been real. Yet the man himself moved with a quiet certainty. He had no need to convince everyone. His life was the proof, his eyes were the evidence, and his voice was the witness. Each morning he would walk through streets that had once been a blur of sound and smell, now alive with shape and color. Children ran past with bursts of laughter, and for the first time he could watch their games instead of simply hearing them. Merchants called out their wares, and he could see the faces behind the voices that had once been disembodied in his world. With every step, the reality of his healing became more deeply rooted. It was not long before people began to stop him intentionally. Some asked about the details, how the mud had felt on his eyes, what it was like to see for the first time. Others asked about the man who had healed him. He found himself telling the story over and over, each retelling sharpening the moment in his memory. But with each telling, the story grew less about the mechanics of mud and water and more about the person of Jesus. A fruit seller, hearing his account, stood in silence for a long moment before saying, "If he could give you sight, maybe he can give me hope." A mother with a sick child asked, "Do you think he would help my son?" The man could not promise what Jesus would do, but he could speak of what he had already done. "Go to him," he would say. "You will see for yourself." In some quarters, the talk of Jesus stirred anger. The religious authorities' opposition had not cooled, and their suspicion of anyone connected to him was strong. A neighbor warned the man quietly, "Be careful who you speak to. They will mark you for following him." But he could not remain silent. To keep his story hidden would be like closing his eyes again after they had been opened. One evening, as the shadows lengthened, he sat outside the gates watching the last light fade from the sky. A group of travelers stopped to rest nearby. They spoke of the Galilean teacher they had heard in the temple courts, the one who taught with authority unlike any other. The man listened, then leaned forward. "I know him," he said. "I was blind from birth, and he gave me sight." The travelers turned toward him, surprised, and urged him to tell more. And so, under the growing night, he recounted the entire journey, From the roadside where Jesus found him, to the Pool of Siloam, to the first moment his eyes opened, and finally to the meeting where Jesus revealed himself as the Son of Man. When he finished, there was a pause. One of the travelers whispered, "If he is who you say he is, we must see him ourselves." The man nodded, a faint smile on his face. That was the heart of his testimony, not to hold people's attention on him, but to point them to Jesus. The more he shared, the more he realized his healing was not just a gift for himself. It was a sign meant to draw others to the light. Each conversation was an opportunity for seeds of faith to be planted. Some would take root immediately, others might lie dormant until the right time, but he knew that telling the truth was his part. He no longer feared the disapproval of those who had cast him out. He had found a new belonging, not in a building or an institution, but in the presence of the one who had sought him out, healed him, and revealed himself. That belonging gave him courage to keep speaking, even when it was risky, even when the faces in front of him looked skeptical. And so the man who had once been a silent fixture in the city's corner became a voice echoing through its streets. His story was simple: once blind, now seeing; once in darkness, now in light. And in telling it, he invited others to step into that same light. It did not take long for word of his continued testimony to reach the ears of the religious leaders again. Whispers in the marketplace, reports from those who still followed their authority closely, all carried the same message. The man who had been healed was speaking freely about Jesus. Some of the leaders saw it as a direct challenge to their control. They began to watch him from a distance, appearing suddenly in crowds when he was telling his story, listening in silence, their expressions unreadable. One morning, while he was explaining to a small group of townspeople how Jesus had placed mud on his eyes and sent him to wash, a pair of Pharisees stepped forward. "We've heard enough of your tales," one said sharply. "This man you follow breaks the Sabbath and misleads the people. You would do well to stop speaking of him before you bring judgment on yourself." The man met their gaze without flinching. "I only speak of what I know," he said. "I was blind, and now I see. If that is not from God, then you must explain it, because I cannot deny it." His voice was steady, not defiant for its own sake, but unshaken in its conviction. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, wary of the tension. Others leaned in, their eyes betraying curiosity or quiet agreement. A woman at the edge of the group glanced around nervously before speaking. "I heard him teach once," she said softly. "What he said, it was like light in my heart." Her words were quickly met with frowns from a few nearby, but the man noticed the way others silently nodded. It became clear to him that not everyone was against Jesus. Some simply feared the consequences of open belief. His own life had already been changed by being cast out of the synagogue, yet he found that the cost no longer frightened him. If anything, it gave him freedom. He had already lost the place others feared to lose, and in its place, he had gained something worth far more. The leaders did not hide their disdain. "You are no teacher," one of them scoffed. "Your words are nothing compared to the law of Moses, which we have studied all our lives." The man's reply was calm but unyielding. "I do not claim to teach above Moses. I claim to tell the truth about what God has done for me. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." The Pharisees left in anger, their robes sweeping the dust behind them. The crowd broke into murmurs. Some shook their heads, unwilling to be drawn into the conflict, but a few lingered, approaching the man quietly once the leaders were gone. One older man said in a low voice, "Your courage gives me courage. I have seen things in him that I cannot explain away. Perhaps one day I will stand as you do." These private moments became treasures to the healed man. He knew he was not converting entire crowds in a single conversation. But he also knew that faith often begins in whispers, in the quiet stirring of the heart when truth is heard. Even if the change was hidden, even if the seed of belief would not grow for years, he believed his role was to speak and to live as someone whose life bore witness to the light. Opposition continued, sometimes openly, sometimes in the form of subtle exclusion. Yet every time he told his story, the details remained unchanged, his words anchored in the certainty of his own transformation. The more he spoke, the more he understood that his healing had been more than a momentary miracle. It had been the beginning of a mission. He could still remember the exact moment the light broke into his darkness. And now, in each telling, he offered that same light to others. Whether they accepted it or not, whether they spoke it aloud or kept it hidden in their hearts, the truth remained the same. He had been blind, and now he could see. And the one who gave him sight was worthy to be known. As the days turned into weeks, the man's life settled into a new rhythm, though it was unlike anything he had known before. He no longer sat in the shadow of the city walls, waiting for coins to drop into his hands. Instead, he walked the streets with his head lifted, seeing the city that had once been only sound and imagination. His vision was no longer just physical. It was shaped by the moment he met the one who had opened his eyes. He often thought back to the pool where it had all begun, to the cool water against his face, to the first burst of light that had shattered a lifetime of darkness. That moment had changed his world forever, but it was not the end of the story. If anything, it was the starting point. The real journey had been everything that followed. The questions, the confrontations, the rejection, the rediscovery of belonging in the presence of Jesus, and the courage to speak even when the cost was high. He had come to realize that his healing was never meant to be a private gift for his own comfort. It was a sign, a living testimony meant to point beyond himself to the one who had touched him. Every conversation, whether with a curious neighbor or a skeptical leader, became an opportunity to shine that light. He didn't need to know all the answers to the questions people asked. He didn't have to explain the mysteries of how Jesus had done it. His story was simple but unshakable. Once I was blind, now I see. Sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn, he would remember the face of Jesus on that street. The way he spoke without hesitation, the way his hands had reached for the dust of the earth to create the mud, the way his command had carried authority without threat. It was not only the miracle that moved him, but the compassion that came with it. Jesus had not only seen his condition, he had seen him. And that was something the man had never forgotten. His story spread far beyond his neighborhood. Travelers carried it to other towns, sometimes adding their own details, sometimes blending it with other accounts of Jesus' works. But those who heard it directly from him always found it the same: clear, consistent, unafraid. The steadiness of his words carried more weight than eloquence ever could. He was living proof that an encounter with Jesus could turn a life around completely. In the years to come, the man would watch as news of Jesus' death and resurrection shook Jerusalem. He would hear the testimonies of others, fishermen, tax collectors, women who had been healed, each story different, but each rooted in the same truth. They had met him, and nothing was the same afterward. In their voices, he recognized the same conviction he carried, the same light in their eyes. For him, the greatest lesson of his healing was that faith often begins with obedience. He had no guarantee that washing in the Pool of Siloam would change anything, but he had gone because Jesus told him to. That first step, taken in darkness, had led him into the light, and that became the pattern for his life. Taking steps of faith, even when he could not see the outcome, simply because he trusted the one who called him. He knew that storms would come, opposition from leaders, misunderstandings from neighbors, seasons when speaking about Jesus might be dangerous, but he also knew that silence was no longer an option. His life had been a public act of God's power, and hiding it would be like closing his eyes all over again. The man born blind became, in his own way, a preacher without a pulpit, a witness without a title. His mission was lived out in daily conversations, in the courage to tell his story to whoever would listen, in the quiet conviction that light is meant to be shared. His healing was the beginning. His testimony was the legacy. And that legacy still speaks today. It calls to anyone who has been touched by the grace of Jesus, anyone who has been brought out of their own kind of darkness, whether visible or hidden. It reminds us that our testimony does not need to be complicated to be powerful, it simply needs to be told. "I was blind, but now I see," is enough to open hearts to the one who heals. So the question now is not only what Jesus has done for us, but what we will do with what he has done. Will we keep it to ourselves, or will we share it so that others might find the same light? The man born blind chose to speak, even when it cost him his place in the synagogue, even when it drew the anger of powerful people. He chose to stand in the truth because the truth had set him free. His journey is an invitation to us to tell our own story, to live in the light, to let our lives become a testimony that points to Jesus. And just like him, we may discover that the more we share, the clearer our own vision becomes, not just of the world around us, but of the one who has given us sight. If this story has stirred your heart, I invite you to take the next step. Share your testimony. Tell someone what Jesus has done in your life.